My jobs was really to help select the keynote speaker and really get to know them. So today's keynote speaker is named Sara Porterfield, and she really offers a different perspective than we usually get at these summits. Because often, most of our presentations are based in kind of either the science of water quality or like focusing on kind of very controversial local issues. But she focuses instead on the history and the narratives we craft about the Colorado River watershed and about how we need to move on from this notion of like a heroic John Wesley Powell taming the great beast of the Colorado and opening it up for development. We need to explore all of the narratives really to craft the story. So Sara has a BA in history from Lewis and Clark College and a PhD in history from CU, and she's also spent a lot of time on the river working 10 plus years as a raft guide for Upward Bound and just spending a lot of time in the American West with her and her dog. And yeah, so like, she's super experienced in the issue as she's founded her own historical consulting firm called Tributaries Consulting, which talks a lot about this and provides resources and research and outreach about the narrative of the Colorado River and about how the different ways we see the Colorado River truly affect policy and how we can use the history of the Colorado River to solve current and future issues. So without further ado, please help me introduce the 2018 keynote speaker, Sara Porterfield.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming out and hanging out with me for the middle of the day. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. And thanks to Sara for helping to organize this, and of course all of you, Aiden, and all of you students who are here doing this really cool work to connect to the rivers and to think about solutions, to think about how we can approach these challenges from what I've heard is a lot of creative and different perspectives. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story and how I got to be where I am. And then I'll talk about the discipline of history and some of the stories that we've forgotten or overlooked in favor of some other ones, and stuff that I've kind of uncovered in my research and some questions that I've learned to ask about the narratives and the stories that we tell. And then talk a little bit about why I think it's so important for you all to get involved and to approach Western water issues from creative perspectives and in some really innovative ways, which it seems like you guys are already doing from the little bit I've heard this morning. So I'll start. You guys are going to see some real gems of me, photos of me. This is me in, I think, 7th or 8th grade. My brother and my cousin would love that I put this picture up here. And my first contact with the Colorado River came starting when I was in middle school. I grew up in Southern California, in suburban Southern California, and I actually grew up in Thousand Oaks, California. It's been a little bit of a rough week for my community. But it was a very different landscape than what we have here, right? We did not have big mountains, we didn't have big rivers there. But when I was in middle school, my family started taking road trips around the American West and to national parks. And so we would drive from our home in Southern California and drive out to Moab, drive to the Grand Canyon, drive up, this picture's at Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park, drive through Colorado, and I fell in love with the Intermountain West. It was so different from where I grew up. It was so much more dramatic, and I in particular fell in love with the desert. And one of my first formative experiences, I would say, came on the Colorado River outside of Moab. How many of you have been rafting on the Colorado River? All right, nice, this is awesome. How many of you have been to Moab? Okay, that's what I thought. So you guys probably know this view if you drive into Moab on River Road. I did not take this picture, I'm not that good of a photographer. But this is the view that you see when you first come into Professor Valley in the Onion Creek area. And when I was in 7th or 8th grade, we went on our 2nd or 3rd trip through Moab, and my parents took my brother and I on just a half-day or a one-day rafting trip on the Colorado Daily. It's not big, exciting whitewater, but there's some rapids. The scenery is incredible. I got to try and row the boat, which I found really, really hard, and I was in awe of my raft guide, who was this really strong woman. And I read everything. I would return home after these trips, and I would read everything I could get my hands on about the Colorado River and about the desert. So how many of you have read Edward Abbey? Okay, yeah, a lot of you. Great. So Desert Solitaire was my introduction to Edward Abbey and to some of the writing about the American West and to the stories that we tell about the American West and our water. Desert Solitaire is his memoir of working as a park ranger in Arches National Park and his time in the desert Southwest. And after that, I read his, probably one of his most famous books, Desert Solitaire and Monkey Wrench Gang, I think are probably about equal. The Monkey Wrench Gang is a novel about this band of friends who decide that they're going to take out Glen Canyon Dam, right? So this is Glen Canyon Dam here on the Colorado near Page, Arizona, far northern Arizona. How many of you have been to Lake Powell? Yeah, okay. Fewer of you than have been rafting. That's kind of cool. So Edward Abbey wrote this book about trying to take out the dam and how bad it was for development. And I think that this was not only my first introduction to, or part of my first introduction to the Desert West, to what the beauty of the desert, to how people thought about the desert, but it was also my first introduction to the kind of stories that we tell about the desert and about our water, right? This was a story that was not limited to just Edward Abbey. This is a story that we still tell today. It's the same kind of form of story, maybe not the exact same content, but very similar content, right? That this big dam was a bad thing. And I'm not going to say it's a good thing, but that this is a common narrative, right, that we tell, that development on rivers is bad because it is not good for ecosystems, it's not good for a healthy flowing river, we don't have all the water that the system is broken, right, that this dam is part of a broken system where we don't have enough water. So I think that Edward Abbey and the Monkey Wrench Gang in particular were kind of my first introduction to these stories that we tell about rivers, or one of my first introductions to that. And as Aiden said, I went to college at Lewis and Clark College in the Pacific Northwest, and I was a history major there. I really liked how the kinds of questions that history gets us to ask. I really liked how it made me think differently about the natural world and the people and places that I may have thought that I knew. But when you start to look at it from a historical perspective, it uncovers a whole range of things that maybe we didn't understand at first. And while I was at college, I started working for the outdoor program. And from that, I started working for the Colorado Outward Bound School. And I've been there for 13 years now. I still work there. And we have a lot of fun. I told you you're going to get some really good pictures of me here. That was a costume night on the river there on the left. Have any of you been on Cataract Canyon in the Colorado? Okay, cool, a bunch of you. Yeah, you've seen this sign, right? Register for your campsites and look out. There's big rapids downstream. And at Outward Bound, I not only learned how to row boats, and guide paddle boats, which I'd wanted to do ever since that first trip on the Colorado with my family. But I also learned a lot more about the Colorado River system. Colorado Outward Bound School, our base in Moab, runs rivers in Dinosaur National Monument. I just heard some of you folks talking about your eco-flight over Dinosaur National Monument. We run the Yampa and the Green up there. We run the San Juan River, and we run Cataract Canyon through Canyonlands National Park. And so I got a lot of experience being on the river, got a lot of experience on the recreation side, learned a lot about boats and how to rig them and how to mostly keep them upright and from getting stuck on rocks. Not always successful in that, but that's how it goes. And I learned a lot about our water systems. This picture on the bottom right is from an activity or a lesson that I give when I'm working for Outward Bound we just call it the Western Waters Talk. And by about my probably 5th or 6th year there, I became the Western Water kind of default talk giver. And I'd seen my friends do it, and I read some stuff about it. But at first I didn't really question too much what I was saying when I gave this talk. And this lesson, folks will build the Colorado River system in the sand out of sticks and rafting gear and rocks and whatever else they can find. And then we'll talk about how the water is used. And both from the perspective of being a raft guide, as well as from the perspective of giving this talk about how water is used in the West and in the Colorado River Basin, I wanted to know more. I thought that there was more to these stories than what we were telling at Outward Bound, what my friends were talking about, what other river guides were talking about. Because we seem to be repeating a lot of the same stories, right? That dams were bad, environmentalists were good, that river guides were this kind of fringe culture, right? They wanted free-flowing rivers, but didn't seem to have a lot of power. And I wasn't really comfortable with repeating those same kinds of narratives. and those same kinds of stories. And I wanted to approach these questions, these stories, from a different angle. And so I went back to school. See, I don't wear silly outfits just when I'm on the river. That's what you have to wear when you become a doctor. That's my advisor, he has to wear more than I do. And so I went back to school to start investigating these histories, to start looking into these stories that we tell, and to try and understand them from a different angle, to try and get at the bigger stories that we're after, the ones we've forgotten, the ones that we've lost in telling the same ones over and over again. And grad school meant a lot of books. As you can see there on the bottom right, I have a whole lot of books. And it also gave me the freedom to ask questions about the natural world. I'm an environmental historian, which means that I study the relationship between people and place, and how that has evolved over time. And I chose to do that through the Colorado River Basin. I still found plenty of time to get out and play in grad school. As you can see in that top left picture, I called my river trips research. So you can turn what you really like to do for recreation, for play, into your career, just so you know. It's not all whitewater rafting, but a lot of it turns into that. And in asking these questions and trying to investigate these stories and where they came from that we tell, I ended up focusing on the Colorado River Basin for my research, for my dissertation. It's kind of like the big report you write as a doctoral student. I ended up focusing on the Colorado River Basin and how it's connected to rivers around the world. We think about the Colorado as being this unique river in the American West, right? It's a big river that a lot of people rely on in a very dry climate. And that's not to say that's wrong, but that we need to pull back a little bit. We need to zoom out and understand the full range of factors that have brought us to where we are today. And so while I was at school, I'm finished with school now. I always forget, I keep forgetting, I just graduated in May, I'm finished with school. So now I'm making it up as I go along. I'm still asking these questions, I'm still trying to figure out what's going on with these narratives, still trying to figure out what's going on with these stories, but I'm doing it on my own now, essentially. I mean, I've got lots of friends and folks and a great support system who help me out. But I thought that the Western water community needed a historian. And so I decided to give myself that job. Jury's still out whether or not people want me to be the Western water historian, but we'll see. And so I started my own company, as Aiden said. And I still sit on riverbanks and raft rivers and talk about water. That picture on the top right is from last week. I do a lot of stuff like this, standing up and talking to groups like you all. And what I've learned from being on the river, as well as starting my own business and thinking about these stories, this is a list of questions that I've come up with that we can use to start interrogating the stories that we tell. Or this is a list of what I've learned. We tell a lot of stories about the Colorado River Basin and Western water. We've told these same stories, more or less unchanged, for a very long time. It's mostly men who tell or are featured in these stories, historically. If you look at the literature on Western water, it's mostly male authors. That's starting to change. The stories are mostly about men, white men usually. I've also learned there are lots of other stories that we can and should tell that give us a much more diverse range of perspectives, of voices, and insights that help shape Colorado River Basin history. And that these stories have historically been marginalized or forgotten about and pushed to the side. And that when we remember, we uncover these stories and start to tell this diverse history, it can open doors to bring more people to the table to start making decisions about our present challenges and into the future. And that's where you all come in. So let me give you a couple of quick examples about things that I've learned. The first one is something that I've done research into both of them. The first one raises a lot of questions for me. They both do, but the first one in particular, I'd say that the first one's a little bit less complete. So let's talk about John Wesley Powell. How many of you have heard of John Wesley Powell? Yeah, what's he famous for? What's he famous for? Yes. Yeah.
He was like the first person to raft the Colorado, or like the Grand Canyon, I guess.
Yeah, first known person, right, to raft the Colorado River. He started in Green River, Wyoming, on the Green River, floated down through the confluence of the Green and the Colorado, through the Grand Canyon, and he got off the river just west of the Grand Canyon. And he did all this, you can't tell quite, maybe you can see it in that middle picture, he did all this with one arm. He was a Civil War hero. He lost his arm fighting for the Union in the Battle of Shiloh. And his story has been told in two different ways. First, that he's this incredible adventurer, right? It's pretty amazing that he did this. He had one arm, he went out into the interior west, into the Colorado Basin, which Americans didn't know anything about at that time, right? This is pretty cool stuff that he went out there to go try and figure it out. So he's talked about as an adventurer. He's also talked about as a prophet, right? And this picture on the left is his map of the western states if we had drawn them around watersheds instead of in the state boundaries that we have. He wanted to settle the West more slowly. He wanted to settle the West, we can think about it today as more sustainably. That's not the language that he would have used in the late 19th century, but that's how he's been talked about. So he told this story about Powell for a long time. And what the story depends on, one, is that the Colorado River Basin was unknown. And I think a good question to ask is, well, unknown to whom, right? Certainly there were indigenous people out here who knew this river basin really, really well at the time. But John Wesley Powell has been seen as the first one to go down, as in his words, down the great unknown. And so it's important to think about, well, who's included in that story and who's not included in that story, right? The indigenous voices are not included in that story. This graph on the bottom right is just instances of John Wesley Powell talked about in books. You can see it's getting more popular as time goes on. And the other thing that Powell does, and when we focus on his story, is that we focus on the Colorado River Basin as a regional and a national story, right? This is a place that's very different than anywhere else in the United States, right? It's very dry. It seems like it's desolate. It seems like it's empty, even though we know there's indigenous people here and other people, people of Hispanic descent, etc. But my research has shown that telling this story like this leaves out a whole global conversation about resource use that actually shaped, in large part, the policy that we ended up with, the legislation, the laws that govern the Colorado River Basin today. Powell was in conversation with a guy named George Perkins Marsh. George Perkins Marsh traveled all over the world, and he learned a lot about water systems, from dry areas like the desert Southwest to really, really wet areas, and everything in between. He studied canals in Amsterdam. He studied the deserts of the Middle East. And a lot of his thinking influenced John Wesley Powell. And later, after Marsh, there were a couple other folks who went to India. And a lot of our legislation is based on what they observed in India. So when we shift our focus, when we look from a different perspective, we can see that the story of the American West is not a story of this unique place within the nation, but actually it's been influenced by forces from around the world. That's my first example. My second example, how many of you have heard about the Echo Park Dam controversy? We got a few hands. Okay, I heard some of you talking about Dinosaur National Monument, right? So there was a proposed dam in Dinosaur National Monument, which you can see here. Here's Colorado. We're kind of right about here right now, I think. And here's Dinosaur National Monument up in the northwest corner of the state, and it spills over a little bit into Utah. Now, in the mid-1950s, early 1950s, the Bureau of Reclamation proposed a dam right there at Echo Park, at the confluence of the Green and the Yampa rivers. And the story that's traditionally been told about this dam is that this guy up here, David Brower, as the head of the Sierra Club, he led the charge against this dam. That it was these big conservation organizations, big environmental organizations, that were able to get people to write letters and to speak out on behalf of these rivers. And that he's almost single-handedly responsible for defeating Echo Park Dam. Echo Park Dam was not built, right? That's why you can raft the gates of Lador, and that's why you can raft the Yampa today. But it turns out that this guy, Buzz Hatch, played a huge role in stopping Echo Park. In fact, I think that had Buzz Hatch not been in the place that he was at the time, if he had not spoken out on behalf of free-flowing rivers, that we would have had a dam there. And Buzz Hatch was a river guide. We don't think about river guides being very influential in terms of policy, in terms of legislation. Maybe today we do, but not so much in the middle of the 20th century. And when we shift our focus in this case of the Echo Park Dam controversy, we can see that recreation played a key role in defeating the dam. These are some letters between Don Hatch, who is Bus Hatch's son. He worked with his father, Bus, to defeat this dam. And between Don Hatch and David Brower, this guy up here, who's usually thought of as being the reason that Echo Park Dam was defeated. And as you can see here, Don Hatch writes to David Brower and he says, "Hope I'm not taking up too much of your valuable time with my flood of letters, but feel you may run across something in them that will help our cause." And David Brower, you can see from these letters, he really values the Hatches' perspective. He really values their input. He says, "I wish I could make it clear to you how important your letters are, so that you would never write such a paragraph as the one in which you say you hope you are not taking too much of my time with your letters." What the Hatches did, and what David Brower knew they did, was to, one, provide expertise that Brower and other conservation organizations didn't have. They knew this landscape, they knew the Green and the Yampa rivers really, really well. And so they could provide information and perspectives to the conservation organizations to make their arguments against the dam. And the second thing that these raft guides did was to provide a link between people who may not have otherwise had a chance to get out on the river. They gave them a way to get on the river and to experience these wild places that I think a lot of us in this room, or maybe all of us in this room, really, really love. Right? Whitewater rafting was brand new at that time, and the Hatches were able to show the American public that they could come out. They didn't have to be experts. They could come on a trip over their spring break or their spring break's local, over their summer break and go rafting. And it was that experience of being on the river that the Hatches facilitated and made possible that made people fall in love with these wild rivers and to write letters in support of free-flowing rivers and against the dam. So these two stories show us that we can add different perspectives to the narrative, right? And not only should we incorporate a wider range of perspectives going forward, not only should we bring different angles to questions that we ask about these stories that we tell or problems that we need to solve today and in the future, but when we look back to the past and we examine the past from different perspectives, we can find stories that we've forgotten about, stories that expand the narrative and make it more inclusive, and make it more possible, or give us a reason to be involved if we can see ourselves in those stories, right? As a river guide, it made me really happy to see that, that the Hatches played such a role in defeating Echo Park. And when we tell different stories, we bring a wider range of voices to the table, right? I would like to know what an indigenous perspective of the Colorado River Basin, what their history looks like, right? This map on the top right is a map of India. It shows us that the Colorado is connected to rivers around the world and that they have influenced the Colorado's development. And then also it changes who we see as the central characters, right? We can put women in the middle of the story, right? Which hasn't happened for a really long time. And so what I would say for all of you young folks who are doing such cool work here is that if you can imagine that a career exists, if you think that you have something that, I saw someone talking about their art earlier, right? That's a way to think about solutions, to think about solving these problems, that you can do it, right? My job doesn't really exist right now, I made it up. And I think that it's this kind of creativity that Western Water challenges, that Western Water issues today and in the future really needs. My advisor as an undergraduate in college, he was a historian, and he said that if there's a source that you think, that you can imagine exists, it probably does. So go and find it. And I think that's the same for careers, that if you think that you have an idea or you have a perspective or you have a passion, then follow that and see how it can help you think about water challenges in a new way. So thanks, and I'll take any questions that you guys may have. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Yeah, hi Krista.
Hi. This isn't so much a question, this is a endorsement of what you just said about the value of the public, you know, like river guides getting to the public. There was something called the Grand Canyon Protection Act passed in 1992, and it was passed because river guides in the Grand Canyon were talking to their folks, and every river trip we were passing out brochures about this and talking about it, and there were thousands and thousands and thousands of letters written to Congress about this, and that is the reason that it was passed under George H.W. Bush. It would never have been passed. So I just wanted to emphasize what she said, that there is a real value in all of that. So anyway.
And we can see that today too, right? How many of you have followed the news about the Outdoor Retailer Show? Any of you followed that? Yeah, right. So if you're not familiar with it, it's the outdoor industry's biggest trade show. And it took place it was held in Salt Lake. Certainly environmental justice and social justice advocates who do a lot of work in this sphere. But from what I've observed, one of the most important things is representation, right? Let me go back one slide. This picture, I did this the other day, if you Google image search raft guide, who do you think shows up as a raft guide? White dudes, yeah. So, it took me a little while to find a good picture of a female raft guide, right? And so I think that showing that it's not just white people in the outdoors, it's not just white men in the outdoors, right, is really powerful, right? To see that maybe it's an African-American woman rowing that boat, maybe it's a Navajo man climbing El Cap, right? To just be able to see that representation, it's certainly not the only thing to do, but it's a start, right? And to be able to identify with people that you see doing these sports, whether it's running or biking or rafting or whatever it might be. Second, I think, is for the outdoor industry, which they're starting to do, recognize the groups like Natives Outdoors, like Natives Women's Wilderness, like Brown Girls Climb, that are making it possible, that are helping create the infrastructure to get kids who maybe don't see themselves in these places outdoors. And supporting those organizations, right? And asking those communities what they need to do and how they need to help. Yeah, good. And there's a lot more to do with that, but that's my short answer. Yeah.
Do you ever have people who disagree with the stories that you tell, or don't support the stories that or the stories, I guess?
Yeah, so the question is, do I ever have people who disagree with the stories that I tell or don't support them? Yeah, sure, I do. I was just at a conference last week that I didn't get a bunch of pushback, but I looked out in the audience and it was mostly white men, right? And I was like, oh, I'm going to tell these stories up here, okay. And I had a couple people who came up to me. No one said, I don't want you to do that. No one disagreed with me. But people have been like, oh, really? I more encounter surprise, right? And confusion than I do any sort of pushback, which I've actually been kind of surprised about. I do think that the water community right now, I have felt very welcomed. People are kind of taken aback or kind of surprised. But I felt quite welcomed in saying hey, I'm a historian, I'm here to tell these new stories, and I'm here to question everything that you guys have ever done. And people are like, oh, okay, cool, we don't really get it, but come on in, we want to hear from you. And that's really heartening, and that's really cool to hear. I'm sure that a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm a white woman, right? But I do think that the water community is changing, it is becoming more diverse, it is becoming less male, and I think that we're kind of this turning point for that community, that it is changing and it is opening up. I saw a hand back there. Yeah?
How long have you been interested in this?
Let's see, so this wonderful picture, I think I was really into horses too. There's horses on my socks. I think this was started when I was 12. 12 or 13, we took our first trip out to Canyon Country. But I've always been interested in being outdoors, and I rode horses. I wanted to be outside as much as possible. I loved hiking. I loved doing all that kind of stuff. So that would be 22 years of going to the desert, plus a lot, 31 of hanging out horses. Yeah.
Where's your favorite place to raft?
My favorite place to raft? Oh, that's such a hard question. I think my favorite campsite in the world is actually just over this ridge right here. And you only float for about an hour before you get there. You put it at Hiddle Bottom on the Colorado River, and it's flat water. And then you pull over and You can see the LaSalle Mountains, those mountains back there. You can see the Fisher Towers. You can see Castleton, the rock formation that you can climb. And it's just the most beautiful campsite.
And what's its name? These kids have been there, some of them.
Oh, really? I think it's called Onion Creek.
Onion Creek?
Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, that's one of my, yeah, so if you've been there, you know how incredible it is. I think one of my other favorite sections is the Yampa River up here. You know, because it's largely undammed and there's just always something special. I've been out there when there's a hailstorm that it's hailing so hard that you put a helmet on, right, because it hurts. And there's waterfalls coming off all of the cliffs, and it's a good question, but it's a really hard one to answer. Yeah.
So maybe we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions.
Yeah.
Does anyone have like a blog out there where people write about histories or experiences of the river, whether they're kids or adults?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there's like one place. Sarah, you might have a better.
Not yet.
Put that on
Maybe it's on your list.
Yeah, put it on my list of things to do. Yeah, I mean, I know that there are organizations. I think it's American Rivers invites people to tell their stories about rivers. Yeah, Krista, you probably know.
There's also, and this is really pretty specific, but Grand Canyon River Guides, their quarterly newsletter, the BQR, Boatman's Quarterly News, or Boatman's Quarterly Review, they do an oral history project, and every issue is another guide and their history, and you know, a lot of them are women or native guides, or it's just looking at the whole community of Grand Canyon River Guides. So that's another place to, you know, check it out.
Yeah, and all of their past ones are digitized, or most of them are, and they're available online through Northern Arizona University's Klein Library, or you can find it through the Grand Canyon River Guides website. So you can go and read these stories about people in the 60s when commercial guiding was kind of just starting out, and read crazy stories about stuff that they did.
All right.
Thank you guys.
So as I said earlier, we're learning about all these different perspectives, and I just want to thank Sara again for driving over from Boulder and sharing some more perspectives. So here's what happens next. So we have food, like I said earlier, and the line for the food, here's how it's going to work. You start over here by the speaker, and you grab a soda or Gatorade or whatever you want off that table or in that cooler, but just not yet. And so you're gonna come to the front of the room, you're gonna go this way, everybody just keep listening. You're going to grab a soda, then we're going clockwise around the room. Then you're gonna check out that really cool poster while you're waiting your turn. We have some student presentations that were not spoken, but were presented on a poster. So please check out the poster in the back of the room from Glenwood High School. And then next to the blue jug are the water bottles. And then after that, there are burritos. Now here's the deal. There's steak, there's chicken, there's vegetarian, and there's 3 vegan ones. So if you are a vegan person, hope you can make sure you grab that. There's also chips, and then there's more granola bars and things.